Today we're going to talk about parsing JSON. So remember that when we want to communicate with an API or web service, often the format of the data that we receive or send will be in JSON. So a web service again could be a place where you get map data, or a place where you get weather data, or any other sorts of interchange you're going to be sending across the internet. Remember that JSON comes as a string. So it's convenient because it is a simple way to send data as a string across the internet. The problem is, once we receive that data, we need to convert it into something useful, which for us would be variables, like ints and lists and other dictionaries or doubles or floats or things like that. And so that's the act of parsing. Parsing is turning a JSON string into something usable. And so remember that JSON is built around two key ideas. The first is that it's basically a dictionary. It's a key value pair system, which we've used as hashes, as dictionaries, as hash maps, etc. The second idea is that really there's only two, quote, types in JSON. There's objects, which are single collections of properties, and then there are arrays or lists, which are basically a group of multiple items or multiple objects. So, quick review, this is an example of a JSON object. This would be a nested object. So what we have here, we have the start of our object because it's got curly braces. Here we have the key. The key is the word forecast. You can see it's a string. And then the value, separated by the colon here, is everything that comes after it. So it's going to be this big chunk of data here. That is the value. And you can see the value itself has another key. And that key has two properties here, high and low. Those are going to be the value properties. We can also have arrays. Same kind of idea. Here's my object. Daily temp is my key. What's stored at that key? Well, it is a list or an array. And again, it's going to start at 0, 1, and 2. So that's how JSON works. Now, how do we convert this into something usable that the Argon can understand? Well, JSON is string data, and so if you want to parse that, there's a lot of C or C++ techniques that you can use to manipulate them. These C techniques are actually what we would say low level. You can use them. They do actually end up opening up some security holes because of the way that we would have to code them. So we're actually going to avoid that. Instead, we're going to use a library, which will make our lives much easier. There's a lot of libraries that you could use. The one that we're going to use is called JSON Parser Generator RK. This is built specifically for the Argon by a member of the Particle community. They may work at Particle, I'm not entirely sure. But it's very active in the community, and it's pretty useful. So what I've provided below is some sample code for your event handler. Now, the first part, you don't have to change. It's designed, if you've got your data coming in multiple pieces, you can ignore that. Just include the code and it'll work. The second part is where we're going to adapt our code. So remember, this is the event handler. So you've subscribed to an event, this event handler has been triggered. So here, this is what I call part 1. That part, you can just copy that and you don't have to touch it. Okay? Remember that data is going to be the message, that this is going to be the JSON that's going to be sent back from your event. So all part 1 is doing is gathering the data from multiple pieces, if that were the case. You basically just ignore that. We're just going to use that. The part we are going to focus on is this part. This is part 2. This is the part that is unique to whatever API you're using. So let's get started. The first thing that you would do is you got to include your library. So JSON parser generator rk.h. Then you need to create a global variable, which is basically an object, and this is going to handle all of the parsing. Okay, the part we're not going to describe right now, because we've described it elsewhere, is you create a webhook, you trigger that with Particle, you then subscribe to the response, and you trigger the event handler. So we've described that in other places. So what I just want to focus on right now is, imagine that you have sent the signal, right? From your device up to the cloud. The cloud has then gotten a message from the whatever your API is, and then that message has come back this way, and then it's come back to you. Okay? So here you now have your JSON. Your JSON is the received message. So let's just accept that, and let's see what happens. How do we respond to that message? Here's a really simple example. Imagine the response to a message is my object here. My object has one key called place, and it has a value of this data here. So now if we look at what our event handler code would be, let's first recall what did the data look like. We had quote place, colon, and then another curly brace, and we had quote city, colon, Los Angeles. And I think we also had state as well. So what are we doing? Well, we have this standard code, JSON parser.getReference. Okay? So that's just default code. That says I'm trying to get some data. And then you just kind of chain down the objects. So I'm looking for it. So I have a method called .key. So I say key place. So that's going to take me basically to here. When I'm at that place in the JSON object, I then access another key. That key is called city, which takes me to here. And then now I am where I want to be. I look at this data and I say, what kind of data is it? Well, it's a string, so I call the method value string. And if I call that, this chain of methods, they're all sort of connected together. I know it's a little bit strange to see this many methods with periods, but these are just objects calling objects and kind of going deeper and deeper, chaining methods. We store that into a variable called city. And now city basically is Los Angeles. And this is how we would get data. And you can imagine that this value string method, there's also a value, or double value float, etc. We can look in the documentation to see a lot of the other methods, but this just gives us an overall quick illustration of one example of how we could pull some data from JSON into the rest of our program.